In 1519, a German banker sat in his counting house in Augsburg and made a decision that would change the course of European history. He would buy the Holy Roman Empire. Not conquer it, not inherit it, buy it. His name was Jakob Fugger, and by the time he finished, he had financed 5 popes, owned the loyalty of the Habsburgs, controlled Europe's silver and copper supply, and accumulated wealth that, adjusted for the economy of his time, made him richer than Rockefeller, richer than Bezos, richer than any single human had ever been. But here's what made him different from every ruler, every king, every conqueror before him. He didn't need armies. He had something more powerful. He had credit. And he understood that whoever controls credit controls who wears the crown. When Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, came begging for loans to fund his wars, Jakob didn't just give him money. He bought a piece of the empire itself. When the Pope needed funds to build St. Peter's Basilica, Jakob didn't donate. He invested and charged interest on salvation. By the time Jakob Fugger passed in 1525, he had created something that had never existed before, a financial empire that transcended borders, outlasted kings, and operated by rules that only he fully understood. This is the story of the man who invented modern capitalism and discovered that the ultimate power isn't commanding men, it's owning their debts. Before Jakob Fugger, wealth meant land. Kings measured power in acres conquered. Nobles counted their worth in castles and serfs. Merchants were considered beneath aristocracy, tolerated for trade, but never respected. Jakob Fugger changed that calculation forever. He proved that money, properly deployed, strategically lent, ruthlessly collected, could purchase what armies could only temporarily seize: legitimacy, authority, and perpetual power. If you value deep dives into the hidden machinery of history, consider joining our community of 1,000 subscribers. We are building a library of financial history that you won't find in school books. Born in 1459 into a family of weavers who had climbed into minor merchant status, Jakob was the 10th of 11 children. By all logic, he should have remained invisible, a younger son with no inheritance, destined for the church or obscurity. Instead, he became the architect of a system where money didn't just buy things. It bought people. It bought policies. It bought papal decrees and imperial elections. It bought the future itself, contracted and delivered like any other commodity. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. The Fugger banking network spanned from Lisbon to Budapest, and their model still operates in your city today. Let's explore how the first capitalist emperor built an empire without ever wearing a crown. Jakob Fugger was born into a world that didn't want him. The Fugger family had risen from weaving into modest merchant trading over 2 generations. His grandfather, Hans, had been a simple weaver. His father, Jakob I, had expanded into textile commerce with Venice. Respectable, profitable, but hardly remarkable in a city like Augsburg, where dozens of families competed in the same trade. As the 10th child, young Jakob had no claim to the family business. His older brothers would inherit. His path was predetermined: the church. At 14, he was sent to Rome to train as a priest, expected to bring ecclesiastical connections back to the family, a common strategy for surplus sons. But Rome taught Jakob something his brothers never learned: how money really worked. In the Vatican, he didn't see spiritual authority. He saw financial machinery. He watched cardinals negotiate benefices like commodities. He observed how papal offices were bought and sold. He learned that the church, supposedly above worldly concerns, operated as the most sophisticated banking network in Europe. The Medici had already demonstrated this in Florence. Banking and papal favor were inseparable. But the Medici were Florentine nobility. Jakob was a German merchant's son. He would have to be better, smarter, more ruthless. In 1485, Jakob's older brothers made a catastrophic business decision. They had borrowed heavily to expand the textile trade, just as the market collapsed. The Fugger firm teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. Jakob, now 26, had returned from Rome with no official authority in the family business. But he made an offer his brothers couldn't refuse. "Let me handle the finances and I'll save us." What he proposed was radical. Instead of competing in crowded textile markets, he would pivot the entire firm into something that had reliable, desperate customers: metal mining and lending to nobility. Jakob understood something that would define his entire strategy. Nobles and kings always needed money. Not wanted, needed. For wars, for prestige, for survival. And they would pay any interest rate, accept any terms, if you structured the loan cleverly enough. His first major move was securing a contract with the Habsburgs, the family that controlled vast territories but chronic cash flow problems. Archduke Sigismund of Tyrol needed funds desperately. He controlled silver mines but lacked capital to extract the ore. Jakob offered him a deal. Loan him the money, but take repayment not in cash, but in silver itself at prices Jakob set. It was brilliant. Sigismund got his loan. Jakob got control of the silver supply. Within a decade, the Fugger firm controlled most of the Tyrolean silver and copper output, the essential metals for coinage and weapons. Kings needed both, and now they needed Jakob. By 1495, the firm that had nearly collapsed was the most important mining and banking operation in the Holy Roman Empire. Jakob's brothers, recognizing his genius, stepped aside. Jakob Fugger, the spare son, the would-be priest, became the sole head of the Fugger Empire. He was 36 years old, and he was just beginning. Jakob Fugger's true innovation wasn't lending money. It was creating dependence. Traditional moneylenders gave loans and hoped for repayment. Jakob structured loans so that repayment became impossible, but the relationship became permanent. He lent to Emperor Maximilian I constantly. Tens of thousands of guilders for wars in Italy, campaigns against the Swiss, conflicts with France. Maximilian always needed more, and Jakob always provided it, at terms that guaranteed Maximilian could never fully repay. But Jakob didn't want repayment. He wanted leverage. Instead of cash, he accepted payment in mining rights, in trade monopolies, in tax farming privileges, the right to collect taxes on behalf of the emperor and keep a percentage. Each loan deepened Maximilian's dependence. Each new privilege gave Jakob more control over the empire's actual economic infrastructure. The emperor ruled in name, but Jakob controlled the resources that made ruling possible. This was unprecedented. Merchants weren't supposed to have this kind of power. The nobility viewed commerce as beneath them. But Jakob understood that disdain was convenient. It meant they didn't notice until too late that the merchant now owned more of the empire than the emperor did. By 1500, the Fugger firm had agents in every major European city: Venice, Rome, Lisbon, Antwerp, Budapest, Krakow. This wasn't just a business network. It was an information network. Fugger agents reported on harvests, on troop movements, on political gossip, on price fluctuations. Jakob knew what was happening in Europe faster than most kings knew what was happening in their own kingdoms. And information, deployed through lending, became the ultimate weapon. When Portugal opened trade routes to India, Jakob financed their expeditions in exchange for a share of the spice trade. When Spain discovered silver in the New World, Fugger agents were there to arrange the European distribution. When Hungary needed to defend against Ottoman invasions, Jakob financed their army and acquired Hungarian copper mines. His most audacious move came in 1503, financing the papal election. The papacy was in chaos. Cardinals were divided. The position needed someone who understood money and could manage church finances. Jakob backed Cardinal Francesco Tedeschini Piccolomini, providing the funds necessary to secure votes. The cardinal became Pope Pius III. He lasted 26 days before passing. Jakob didn't mourn. He financed the next election too. This time, his candidate, Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, became Pope Julius II and reigned for a decade. Julius needed vast sums to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica. Jakob lent the money, and in return, secured the right to sell indulgences throughout Germany, essentially selling spiritual forgiveness and sending a percentage to Rome while keeping the rest. This arrangement, financing popes and profiting from salvation, would eventually trigger the Protestant Reformation when Martin Luther objected to the whole system. But for Jakob, it was simply business. Faith was fine, but credit was eternal. By 1510, Jakob Fugger had created something that hadn't existed before, a private firm that functioned as the de facto treasury for emperors, popes, and kings. They didn't borrow from him occasionally. They borrowed constantly. Their legitimacy depended on his willingness to extend credit. He had built a machine where debt created power, and power created more debt. And he sat at the center, collecting interest on the entire European political system. The only question remaining was, could he buy the empire itself? In January 1519, Emperor Maximilian I passed away suddenly. The Holy Roman Empire, a patchwork of German states, Italian cities, and territories stretching from the Netherlands to Hungary, needed a new emperor. And the position wasn't inherited. It was elected. 7 prince-electors would vote: the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne, the king of Bohemia, the Count Palatine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. Whoever won their votes would become the most powerful ruler in Christendom. 2 candidates emerged: Charles of Spain, Maximilian's grandson, age 19, and Francis I of France, young, ambitious, rich. Francis had the French treasury behind him. He could offer enormous bribes, hundreds of thousands of gold écus to each elector. He was confident. France was powerful. Money was plentiful. But Charles had something better. He had Jakob Fugger. Charles himself had almost no money. Spain was wealthy in New World gold, but most of it was already spent or promised. The Habsburg territories were vast, but cash poor. Charles couldn't compete with French bribes using his own resources. So Jakob made an offer that changed history. I'll loan you everything you need to buy the election. Every bribe, every payment, every promise, whatever it costs. The sum was staggering: 850,000 guilders, more than most kingdoms collected in taxes in a year. It was the largest loan ever made to a single individual up to that point in history. But Jakob's terms were precise. The loan would be repaid with mining rights in Spain and New Spain, Mexico, trade monopolies, tax collection rights throughout the empire, first priority on all imperial revenues. Charles agreed. He had no choice. Jakob's agents moved across Germany with chests of gold, visiting each elector personally. The bribes were delivered, not with Spanish gold, with Fugger gold. Mainz received 110,000 guilders. Brandenburg received 138,000. Saxony and the Count Palatine split 102,000. Each archbishop was promised future benefits. The king of Bohemia was promised trade concessions. Every elector had a price, and Jakob paid it. In June 1519, the votes were cast. Charles of Spain won unanimously. He became Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful monarch in Europe, ruler of an empire on which the sun never set. But everyone in the room understood the truth. Jakob Fugger had just purchased an emperor. After the election, Charles tried to distance himself from the embarrassing reality of how he'd won. He was emperor by divine right, not because a merchant bought him the position. Jakob wrote him a letter. It was polite, respectful, and terrifying in its directness. It is well known that your imperial majesty could not have acquired the Roman crown without me. and I can prove this with the written statements of your Majesty's agents. Translation: You owe everything to me. Don't forget it. Charles never tried to reduce his debt again. For the rest of Jakob's life, the Holy Roman Emperor paid him faithfully because Jakob had proof that the empire had been purchased, not inherited. Jakob Fugger had done what no conqueror had managed. He'd acquired an empire without raising an army. He'd simply bought it, and everyone knew it. Jakob's financing of papal indulgences had made the Fugger firm unfathomably wealthy, but it also planted seeds of destruction that would split Christianity itself. The system worked like this. The Pope authorized the sale of indulgences, documents that promised reduction of time in purgatory in exchange for donations. Technically, these were spiritual instruments. Practically, they were financial products. Jakob's agents sold them throughout Germany. The revenue was split. Half went to Rome to fund St. Peter's Basilica, half stayed with the Fugger firm as repayment for loans to the Vatican. It was efficient, it was profitable, and it was morally grotesque. In 1517, a monk named Martin Luther, teaching theology at the University of Wittenberg, saw Fugger's agents selling indulgences and was horrified, not just at the concept, but at the commercialization. The church wasn't offering grace. It was running a protection racket, with Jakob Fugger as the collection agent. Luther wrote his 95 Theses, nailing them to a church door, objecting not just to indulgences, but to the entire system of financial corruption that had infected the church. Jakob was unconcerned. Monks objected to commerce all the time. The church would suppress this one like all the others. Business would continue, but Luther didn't stop. He had access to the printing press, a recent technology that could spread ideas faster than the church could suppress them. His writings circulated across Germany. His objections resonated with a population that had watched their coins flow to Rome and to Fugger's counting houses. Within years, the Reformation had split the church. Half of Germany converted to Protestantism. The authority of Rome was fractured permanently. Jakob watched his indulgence revenue collapse. The Protestant territories refused to pay. The system he'd built with the Vatican was breaking apart. But he didn't panic. He simply reallocated. If Germany was dividing, he would finance both sides. He lent to Catholic princes fighting to preserve the old faith. He lent to Protestant princes fighting for the new one. He sold weapons and supplies to armies on both sides of the religious wars. War, he understood, was the most reliable customer of all. It consumed resources infinitely and paid any price. By his final years, Jakob had become something unprecedented in European history, a private citizen whose wealth and influence rivaled emperors. He lived modestly by aristocratic standards. No palace, no crown, no title beyond merchant. But he controlled resources that kings could only dream of. The Fugger firm's books showed assets equivalent to 2% of Europe's entire GDP. In today's terms, that would be roughly $400 to $500 billion, making him wealthier proportionally than any single individual in modern history. But his true legacy wasn't the wealth. It was the system. He had proven that money, properly deployed, could buy anything: empires, popes, wars, peace. That debt was a more effective tool of control than conquest. That the real power in society belonged not to those who ruled, but to those who financed the rulers. Kings would pass, dynasties would crumble, but the system Jakob created, where private finance shaped public power, that would become permanent. Jakob Fugger passed away on December 30th, 1525, at age 66, in his counting house in Augsburg. He left behind the largest private fortune in history and a nephew, Anton Fugger, to manage it. The firm would continue for another century, slowly declining as the Habsburgs defaulted on loans and Spanish silver shipments disrupted the metal trade. But the template Jakob created never disappeared. It simply evolved. What Jakob understood, And what every financier since has rediscovered is that power doesn't flow from crowns or constitutions. It flows from whoever controls credit. Kings need money for legitimacy. They need to pay armies, build monuments, project strength. When they can't generate that money themselves, they borrow. And when they borrow, they become subordinate to whoever lends. Jakob was the first to systematize this insight, to build an organization specifically designed to lend to the powerful and use that debt as leverage over policy, over resources, over the future itself. The Medici had done something similar in Florence, but they operated within one city-state and lost power when the political wind shifted. Jakob operated transnationally. He diversified his lending across multiple kingdoms, multiple popes, multiple wars. When one borrower faltered, others remained solvent. His network was anti-fragile. It grew stronger through chaos because chaos created more desperate borrowers. This is the model that merchant banks, investment firms, and international financial institutions still follow. Lend to sovereigns. Accept collateral and resources or policy concessions. Build dependence, not just debt. The Protestant Reformation, which Jakob inadvertently triggered through his indulgence business, ended up validating his worldview. The old order, where the church claimed spiritual authority over kings and merchants, collapsed. In a new order that emerged, financial power operated independently of religious sanction. Capitalism, as we now call it, didn't need the Pope's blessing. It simply needed borrowers and an enforcement mechanism for debt. Jakob had proven both could be arranged. Today, when we talk about the IMF lending to countries in crisis, or investment banks financing governments, or private equity firms acquiring infrastructure, we're describing variations on Jakob's model. Do you see the legacy of Fugger's model in today's global economy? I'd value reading your perspective in the comments. Lend to those who need to project power. Accept repayment in assets or concessions. Build a network where your debtor's success depends on your continued support. Jakob never called himself a capitalist. The word didn't exist yet. He simply called himself a merchant. But he built a blueprint for how capital would shape nations for the next 5 centuries. The man who bought emperors proved that the ultimate empire isn't territory. It's debt. And whoever controls debt controls everything that matters. Kings rise and fall. Nations come and go. But the ledger is eternal. Jakob Fugger was buried in the Fugger Chapel he built in Augsburg, a modest monument compared to the cathedrals he'd financed. But above his tomb, he commissioned an inscription that revealed everything about how he understood his life. To the best, greatest, and most benevolent God, and to the memory of Jakob Fugger, who was, in the judgment of everyone, without equal among the wealthy men of his time. Not the most powerful, not the most righteous, the most wealthy, because wealth, properly deployed, had purchased everything else. Jakob Fugger passed away richer than emperors, but his true legacy wasn't gold. It was proving that money, strategically lent, buys more than armies ever could. Every modern financial system, from central banks to sovereign debt to IMF bailouts, operates on principles Jakob pioneered. Lend to the powerful, accept collateral in real assets, build dependence through credit. He bought popes. He bought emperors. He bought the future. And when he was done, he left behind a template that no empire has escaped since. If you're starting to see how money shapes power more than politics ever could, subscribe to follow the rest of this story. Like this if you had never heard of Jakob Fugger, the richest man in history who somehow got written out of history books. Comment which modern institution most resembles the Fugger banking empire. The parallels are everywhere once you see them. Share this with someone who still believes power comes from governments. It doesn't. It comes from whoever holds the debt. The series continues. The next man we cover took Jakob's model and weaponized it to capture an entire city without an army. Jakob Fugger proved that the greatest empire isn't built with swords. It's built with ledgers. And the crown always bows to whoever owns the books.